Hello and welcome to another episode of What a Hell of a Way to Die. It is just me today and Nate, and I am speaking with a special guest, Arash Azizzada. Arash is currently working in organizing, trying to help get Afghans out of Afghanistan, and he recently wrote a piece in the New York Times, which I'm linking to in the show notes. So I was hoping to, very quick, time sensitive, get him on the show to talk about this issue. So Arash, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. I'm doing okay considering the circumstances.
Yeah.
But thanks for having me on.
You're very welcome. So, as I understand it, this project and the work that people have been doing, I know that it's been in the public eye, in terms of all over the news in the United States since the weekend of the Sunday the 15th when Kabul surrendered. But this has been going on for a while, and it's something that I think all of our military listeners and people who've worked in sort of civilian sides of the Defense Department have probably experienced if they ever tried to assist Afghan nationals getting out, getting visas, getting to the United States or elsewhere to partner countries, that there has always been this immense bureaucratic backlog, and you're constantly told, like, don't worry, it's just in processing, and now that's all kind of come crashing down, and there's a lot of people who are at risk. And I was wondering what your experience has been organizing in the Afghan-American community, and significantly in the last really year, but last 30 days, what it's been like for you.
Yeah, I would say, my aim within, I'm a community organizer, and my aim is to organize in my community, which is based in the US, so Afghans here in the diaspora. And I used to live in DC. There's a large Afghan population in Northern Virginia. And now I'm in Los Angeles, so I'm trying to organize some folks over here. And I think whatever way I took, around every corner that I looked, it took me just back to Afghanistan. At its very core, to be in the U.S. when the U.S. is occupying this country and causing damage and harm, I think is puts you in a weird and maybe complex position, but also gives you some type of level of responsibility. And I think specifically 4 months ago was when I think we all kind of looked at each other. So between amongst the three or four other fellow organizers, where we kind of have to do something. This withdrawal is on its way. That's going to put the Afghan people in some kind of odd position, and we're not sure how it's going to play out. But specifically in the past 30 days, we saw kind of the deterioration. And I think what we took away, and what our analysis of the situation is that everything seemed to be like this house of cards anyway.
Yeah.
It seemed like that the Afghan army was not built up properly and was losing ground rather quickly, which it was all already everything was already set in motion before Biden announced the withdrawal. And there's all this criticism of is the withdrawal the right thing to do? And I don't think there's a right answer regarding that. The occupation, I think, in my eyes, at the end, and it's honestly a very complex way to try to navigate what the withdrawal means. But we saw that the institutions that were put in place were not perfect, and they were certainly not built up in the way that the U.S. had promised the world and the Afghan people that is built. So we saw kind of at the very first, just some worrying signs where the Taliban was able to take over a lot of parts of the country. And then it just rapidly deteriorated. I think there's a variety of ways to look at that. One of them being that, quite frankly, the Afghan people are dying, tired of dying, and certainly they are tired of dying for a cause that's not worth it. And so this corrupt, inept government that has not been able to exert any kind of what I call authenticity. It's not an authentic government. It's been plagued by accusations of voter fraud, as well as trying to centralize the national government, which is just also it's reminiscent of America. It's a kind of this federal system where localities govern the way they do. And so, quite frankly, it was shocking to see what happened the past 30 days. I think it was hard to process and to see it happen so quickly. We were expecting for them to hold out a bit longer, I think, because we've seen this history before too, and maybe we can delve into that later, specifically after the Soviets withdrew in '89. The Soviet-backed government of Najibullah lasted 3 years,
Mm.
and this one barely lasted. It did not even last through the full U.S. withdrawal. Like there were
Yeah.
soldiers. This Afghan government didn't even last, so that all the U.S. soldiers could leave Afghanistan.
Like you said, the speed with which it happened caught people so off guard that we're now in a situation where people were in their minds had this notion of an orderly exit, within the next couple of months, and now instead it's just this mass chaos exodus, in which the Taliban hold all the cards, and I have been very surprised by some of the positive responses from people that I know that in some way are connected to Afghanistan, whether that's some veterans and then also, civil society activists, human rights activists, journalists, etc. But the thing that really has shocked me is that there does seem to be quite a bit of kind of, what would the right word here be, indifference. And similarly, I don't know, this idea that if you wanted this to be an easier process to get people out, that somehow is a implicit endorsement of the war. It's been heartening to see that some people care, but it's not enough if it's volunteers, if it's not people who actually have authority to solve this situation. So I wonder if I get your thoughts on this, and then subsequently, like, we're talking about what could be a change that could make a difference given the current situation, like in terms of policy, from the U.S. government.
I think at the very first, like at the core of this, it has to be like, and maybe that doesn't have to be done today, because like we're in this crisis, like the Afghan people find themselves, the Afghan-American community and the Afghan people find themselves, and Afghan diaspora find themselves in this moment of crisis, because we are dealing with a situation where our loved ones, our friends, our family are stuck. And they are not only just stuck in this country, but they are like under threat of this like new repressive regime. And then some of the things that you cited, like this conflict that the U.S. was party of, and the U.S. is partially responsible for that, if not has a really large hand in that. We can talk about the merits of that later, but I think anybody that is probably listened to this podcast know that the U.S. is a bad actor when it comes to the foreign policy that affects the Afghan people. And so, but at its very core, we also have to have a kind of like an honest conversation about the U.S.'s history there, its presence in the past, and also kind of like reframe the fact that this is not a 20-year occupation, actually. And like, we cannot untangle what happened in the past 20 years compared to what U.S. policy was in the '90s, which was like ignoring the country, lobbing a few cruise missiles, and like ignoring this country didn't exist. Then we go to the '80s, and there's also like detrimental, and it's interesting in history what the U.S. intended to do there, but also used the Afghan people and Afghanistan as this like proxy war against the Soviets. and then we keep going back and back, and so we're talking about roughly, to me, this is 50 years of pain and misery that's been inflicted upon the Afghan people by the U.S., as well as like also people should take notice. Like, we are like, I'm a U.S. citizen. I moved here 20 years ago. I became a citizen probably like 10 years ago. So I tend to view things from an U.S.-centric lens, but the U.S. is also not the only bad actor there. I don't think I'd be very warm to a Russian occupation or a Pakistani or a Chinese. There's a lot of bad. We're strategically located, quite kind of unfortunately, and subsequently. So, what can people do? I think what I am currently trying to do as a community organizer, somebody who launched this campaign called Afghans for a Better Tomorrow, I think I'm trying to tap into the larger consciousness of America. And I've seen Americans do this before. I saw them do this during the recent conflict in Palestine, and I saw them do this recently as well during June of 2020, which is roughly a year ago. And so that's the kind of consciousness I'm trying to tap into, because not only do the American people have an obligation, they have they need to, when there's like inhumanity that is happening, and like very much this is on the front page of the world's newspapers, they can't look away. Like, I know the world is watching, but also you can't look away, especially after just like 20-year debacle. And so the things I would say that people can do is to pay attention and to continue to look this way. This week, obviously people are paying attention to Afghanistan the past 10 days more than ever. I'm getting more media requests than I didn't even know certain outlets existed. We're getting more attention than ever before. But I would say, pay attention past today. But the immediate needs, I think, is for folks to contact like their Congress members to put pressure on Congress. In the end, this is a Biden administration decision, and the only person who can make a decision that's right now will reduce harm and help with the evacuation of many vulnerable. They include U.S. citizens, they include green card holders, as well as folks who work for the military, SIV Afghans, as I call them, and P2 Afghans, which are folks who worked in some capacity with a U.S. government funded agency, but also just like folks who listened to the encouragement of like folks like Hillary Clinton, who said break barriers, become leaders, speak out against the Taliban. Well, they did that, and now they're risking their life. So folks can continue to keep up the pressure. There's protests happening on Saturday across the nation that we are encouraged non-Afghans specifically to partake in. We hope veterans show up. And we also have a move on petition. And also, like, we're starting to slowly list a variety of different things. One of the specific things that people can donate to that will benefit refugees coming to the US specifically is to assist in fundraising for the Humanitarian Parole. The issue is that we are having folks who don't qualify for any of the other visas or asylum mechanisms. They have to file for humanitarian parole, which just essentially means, hey, we're letting you into the country on this asylum claim that you're making. The application is $575 and requires a sponsor. So that's like a large fundraising effort that we're putting together. And so I would encourage folks who are listening in, if you're trying to be useful, if you're trying to be proactive, those are some of the ways that you can do that.
Something that I recall is I know that things have changed a lot in immigration to the United States, regardless in terms of the ease or the simplicity of the system. It's become a lot more challenging. But having when I went to language school to learn Pashto years ago, I met a lot of Afghan-Americans who had come over in the 1980s, and one guy in particular that I remember his story. He showed up with a falsified passport but claimed asylum, and effectively had an asylum hearing and then was granted a green card right off the bat. And this was probably about 1988. I know it's become a lot harder for people to get asylum in the United States, and so that has led to this huge kind of outburst of activity with trying to get people filed for visas. So I was wondering if you could talk people through what the ways in which people are able to come over, and the experiences they have, because you have technically a right to claim asylum, but it's not so easy as you can't just at present. It's even though you could technically claim asylum at a U.S. embassy anywhere in the world, that doesn't mean you're going to get it. And a lot of people are in situations where they're looking at, if they can't get on flights, or they can't manage to get out if civilian flights resume at Kabul airport, then they are going to have to get out some other way. And even if their final destination is the United States, it is a very, very long route to get there, to get the authorization to enter the country. And I was wondering if you could talk people through like what kind of situation Afghans who want to get out are facing right now.
Okay, so in this very moment, first of all, I think folks need to know that the U.S. immigration system exists and has a bunch of rules and regulations that are handling they exist to reject people, right? Like,
yes,
it's not a system that exists to like vet people. It kind of feels like that way when you're on the website. It just exists to make it a difficult process, an impossible process. And I will say that I've had a crash course in what it means to be an immigration expert in this past 10 days. And that's unfortunately that this is what this crisis moment has forced us, not just me, but pretty much every other community member to do. There's a variety of different ways. Obviously, if you're a U.S. citizen or green card holder, you can just those are the people at the airport who are probably likely to get in, and they're just essentially blocking everybody else from entering the airport. So they're kind of prioritizing who's allowed, and they're prioritizing um, U.S. citizens and green card holders. So then there's the SIV visa process, special immigrant visa. This category exists for Afghans and Iraqis, specifically who have been interpreters or have worked directly for the U.S. military. There's probably we heard a number today that 5,000 of those got evacuated, but 65,000 of those still are trying to escape. These are like extremely at risk and vulnerable Afghans, obviously because of their association, and it's also very clear that they've done work. These are folks, whatever, they have certificates and there's paperwork. Taliban also has access now, the Intercept reported, to the biometrics of these people. So these folks are definitely their lives are being threatened, and I'm not sure what the next retribution on the Taliban's part looks like, but it's not good. Then there's the P2 category that was only unveiled towards, I think, the end of July, right? So towards the end of July, the Biden administration is almost done with its withdrawal. And it just the State Department announces this new category. Basically, anybody who has worked for a U.S.-funded project or NGO, which is, it's a pretty wide net. Also, if you have worked for a U.S. media outlet, you qualify. The problem being is that it announced this at the last minute. It's a very bureaucratic process that requires you to submit threat letters and documentation. The P2 program specifically is problematic because it says that you have to go to a third country for the process for the application to even start. And also, by the way, who can submit your application? The highest ranking senior employee at the NGO or agency that you worked at. Well, some of these NGOs are defunct, so there was one of the things that I've tried to do, for example, I just tweeted out, hey, who can do research right now? Like, who can help me track down something? And so I have this little, in my DMs, there's just an army of volunteers ready to be helpful. But I'm like, hey, I'm dealing with this person. I'm in touch with this person. They need to file their P2 application. And so can you track down who this supervisor was? And so we've placed some very stressed and alarming calls to folks to say, hey, by the way, there's a person in Afghanistan whose life depends on whether you pick up the phone or not. And then I think the last category is for everyone else. That's called humanitarian parole. And basically, this is it's the acceptance rate is 1%. I think the U.S. last year only took folks in on humanitarian parole for I think it was maybe 2 dozen. We're talking about 25 or less or something like that. The numbers are very, very low, very stringent requirements. You have to be a highly visible human rights defender. And so this is the process we are kind of using for everybody who doesn't fit within the SIV and P2 categories, and basically saying, hey, this person spoke out against the Taliban. They don't fall into other categories, or this person, I don't know if folks are familiar with the Afghan girls robotics team. They won, they're kind of famous for being super accomplished young girls. And so they probably fall into the humanitarian parole program. But that we are doing a large fundraising effort and have this army of 300 lawyers who are assisting pro bono. So there's a bunch of things that are in place, but this is what we have to do when the U.S. government is unable to say. What they could say is, if you're at risk, we'll grant you humanitarian parole. You don't have to file the paperwork. It doesn't have to be a bureaucratic process. And by the way, you don't have to file this $575. By the way, it's $575 per person, including if you have family members. So if you have four family members, that's $575 times 4. It's a lot of money.
Yeah, I am always taken aback by what you were describing previously, the sort of distributed responsibility. So no one person has to feel like they're at fault for a policy that's intended to exclude as many people as possible. And it drives me nuts seeing how this stuff happens, because I live in the United Kingdom now, but obviously I'm an American. And here, for example, the government still has not canceled the deportation proceedings for Afghan citizens in the UK whose asylum claims have been rejected. They haven't. They still have asylum claims pending for about 3,000 people. They could hand wave those and grant those people asylum immediately and take so much stress off the British Afghan community's back, but they won't, because the anti-migrant policies are like a cornerstone of the politics here in this country and in the United States too. I mean, I see this happening with one of the points of contention that I have tried to raise with people is that one of the reasons why there's such a backlog of SIV cases is because they've been cutting the numbers that are authorized per fiscal year. And as you said, those numbers, when Congress authorizes, okay, well, we have 5,000 SIVs for this fiscal year, that is both for people who assisted, as I understand it, people who assisted in Iraq, people who assisted in Afghanistan, but also people who have assisted elsewhere where the U.S. military, is operating and are highly visible. And so, which is not to denigrate the risk that those people are facing, whether you're helping the U.S. in Syria or Mauritania or in Afghanistan, you're still at risk. But it's ultimately these people are clamoring to get the exit papers that they deserve but can't get because of bureaucracy, solely because of a budget item that has effectively been put there. So to my eyes, people can basically brag and be like, see, we're not letting in too many immigrants. Mm-hmm. And the human cost of this, solely because of a very cowardly, in my opinion, approach to this situation. I don't know if people understand that some people, they'll be like, okay, they maybe should have filed their paperwork as soon as they were eligible. But I'm sure you've experienced this. I have a number of my interpreters that have gotten visas outside of Afghanistan, but quite a number of them were eligible for U.S. visas, but the bureaucracy took so long. What they did was they applied, but then also sought out contractor employment working for other NATO militaries because it was easier and faster to get to other countries. And so I have one that I worked with who's here in the United Kingdom, I've got another one who's in the Netherlands, I've got another one who's in Germany. And the one, my friend who's Hazara, he got his in 2014. He'd been working with the coalition since 2005. And at the time when he started, the requirements were 3 years. I think it looks like the SIV has changed to it's 1 year now. But in his case, he had to file his packet 3 times, and it took the intervention of my senator, me as an Army officer, a 2-star general in the National Guard that he had worked with, a bunch of senior people at state and USAID. And it was like, this isn't like a special circumstance. This isn't like an exception to policy. This is literally just the way the system's supposed to work. Like, you're supposed to grant this guy his papers. He's been doing, translating on like foot patrols and helicopter missions in Ghazni and Paktia, in Kunar and Nangarhar provinces. For at the time, 8 years, 9 years. And everyone was just like, oh, surely it's just, he'll get a call next week. It's just around the corner. But the system was defunct even when it was funded. And now it's not. And now people are seeing the human cost of that, where I don't doubt that, if someone actually went through those applications and could do that, quickly, every single one of those people that's filing has a valid claim that they are at risk because they worked with the US. But they budgeted for 5,000 a year, despite the fact that, and I'm sorry, I know I'm talking for a while here. Like, there's been 3 million American troops that have rotated through Afghanistan over 20 years. Like, every single one of those had to have some assistance from Afghan citizens. Like, yeah. Think about how many people that is. Like, that's every single one of those people is now at risk.
Yeah, and one of the things I've realized, and I don't think I realized myself actually, like the 20-year occupation has lasted so long that it has touched so many different lives. And by what I mean by touched, it's like it's been adjacent to Afghan life in so many different ways, and which now means it's endangering so many. Like, there's just a lot of interpreters who have worked with the U.S. for coalition forces because, like, okay, one rotation for like, let's say a 1 year presence, 20 years is a very long time, right? Like, even folks who have who were an interpreter in the very first those in the first years of the occupation, they're still under threat. They're still scared. They're still frightened and don't know what's gonna come next. And like in terms of the U.S. immigration process, when it comes to the SIV, it's just another one of those. It's on the long list of broken promises. The U.S. made all these promises, explicit, implicit. This one was an explicit one. It's like, hey, if you work for us and you want to come over here and like can cite documentation that you're under threat. And by the way, like, how are you supposed to do that? By the way, like it's like the Afghan refugee, like it's hard to like be able to prove to somebody that, hey, like somebody made a threat or like somebody's intimidating. But it's on a long list of things that the U.S. promised. And I think aside of the budgetary item, like we can specifically look at Biden, who got inaugurated in January of 2020. We are now eight months in, right? And like kind of 4 months since made this announcement for the withdrawal. You could have spent the first 8 months of this year throwing a bunch of money at the SIV program and try to clear the backlog. Well, it didn't do that, because it wasn't anticipating what the withdrawal would do, and it didn't anticipate the amount of lives that would be at risk. And this is just the SIV category, and it's like an unfortunate. Like I'm talking to members in our community, and everybody right now has somebody who was some type of interpreter for a soldier or in some capacity work for coalition forces. And so it's really like frustrating because it could have also been like, I understand that the withdrawal was problematic because the occupation was disastrous, right? Like the withdrawal is disastrous because the occupation was disastrous. Those are the realities and facts in front of us. And so, like, as bad as it was, could it have been done better? Well, like, for example, what it could have done is cleared this SIV backlog. So thousands of people wouldn't be outside the airport right now. I'm not saying that there wouldn't be folks outside the airport. There still would be, but at least the SIV folks would have some safety and refuge in this very moment.
Yeah, I think about this too, because you described this about, volunteers trying to locate people who might have worked at an organization who can vouch for someone. I think about some of the cases that I've been helping with, the people that either I know or that are referred to me by people that I know. And, I have extended family members of one of my interpreters who worked as contractors, both with a provincial reconstruction team from the U.S. military and UNAMA in Ghazni in 2005. And it's like, I turned 21 in 2005, 36 now, like trying to find people, maybe from a business card, maybe from a letter of recommendation or a certificate of appreciation, find the right person, or someone who can find them from that organization now. And, you realize that this is to the people whose signature could make the difference between someone getting a visa and not. I feel like it can be a mixed bag. Some people really do care and want to help. Some people are very indifferent. But what I think please correct me if I'm wrong here, my take is that, like you said earlier, it doesn't really matter if you worked for the coalition in 2019 or in 2004. If people, one of the concerns that my former interpreter told me, he said, is that it's not just that the Taliban have a list of people, which they do. It's more that you are now at risk if people want to, for example, to blackmail you, if people want to try to kidnap your children and extort money from you. Like, it's not as though people don't know that you worked in some capacity, whether it was being a gate guard or a cook or a translator or, a subject matter expert, a mechanic, all sorts of things, cultural advisor. And I think that if I had to hazard a guess, one of the things that you said earlier, that they had planned for an orderly exit, so they figured they didn't have to accelerate this. When I look at some of the numbers, and we can talk about the numbers they've been publicizing in a second, the fact that it's always predicated on the biggest number is, okay, we've evacuated 89,000 people since July. And then it's always like, yeah, and we evacuated 84,000 since August 14th or August 10th or something along those lines. And you're like, well, you had the capacity to pull tens of thousands of people out per day.
Mhm.
but you were only doing 5,000 a month at best previously. Like, surely this doesn't come as a surprise that these people need to leave, that the Taliban's going to be part of the government one way or the other. Like, you implicitly endorsed that. So surely you know these people need to leave, and that it's not just like a handful of people. It's 20 years in a country of nearly 40 million people. We've been working, and we've been the in one way or the other the cornerstone of the economy. Like, what do you think people are going to do?
Yeah, and I would also, I think the context that's kind of important for folks to note also is that like the Afghan government was propped up by the West, and just like
Yes.
the Afghan economy was propped up by the West, which is now is since it's not like essentially nothing has been organic about what's happened in the past 20 years, or essentially a lot of things were not organic, which is unfortunate because it makes things a house of cards and makes things fragile. Um, and so when you put together something that's so heavily reliant on the West, um, the specifically if we can talk about the P2 program, right? Like
Sure.
the category is if you work for some type of U.S. Funded agency or project. Well, when you've sent billions of dollars of money for development, for aid through NGOs, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, Kabul was like the capital of like NGO work and foundation money and development and humanitarian aid, because it was a country that was at pretty much at rock bottom before the invasion.
Yeah.
And so who comes basically there's a lot of people who have touched the U.S. presence in some capacity, and now all those folks are at risk. I think the Biden administration obviously like did not see this coming and did not expect the Taliban to take over so quick, and held out hope and just was like, hey, like I think they also made a calculation that like we can abandon the Afghan people, and like it's a cold calculation, but they said, hey, on a political level, this is not going to matter. Like during the midterms, are folks going to vote and say, well, a bunch of Afghans died? Uh, uh, it's painful to admit that, but like that's not what's going to be the deciding factor in November of
Yeah.
2022. And I think what they could have done, for example, is just clear this backlog. And for example, the P2 program was announced less than 3 weeks ago. Those are very like unacceptable things that we can point out immediately and say that's something it could have done better. And by the way, like SIV program under Biden, under Trump, under Obama, it's like a bipartisan failure. Like everybody owns this war, by the way. Like this is not a Biden thing, this is not a Trump thing. This is like both aisles. This is empire. This is imperialism. This is what it looks like for the past 20 or 40 years, whatever you want to look at it. There's just like the total disregard for Afghan life is, I think, the hardest pill to swallow. Like we can get into the nitty gritty of the policies. At the end of it, it's just like people make calculations and they say Afghan lives. They just like they don't care.
Let me ask you. I know that a lot of times people who aren't familiar with the situation, people in the United States or people outside, look at the 2001 invasion after 9/11 and sort of treat that as like year zero. But the U.S. has been involved in Afghanistan for a very long time, and you describe in the 90s and in the 1980s as well. But to my understanding, uh, it's been even longer than that. And I wonder if, obviously in the 1970s, there was a significant amount of money and effort put towards destabilizing the government post-coup. But even in the 1960s, the U.S. was dumping U.S. aid money significantly. I mean, the kind of totem of that is the Kojikai Dam in, I believe, in Helmand province. I can't remember if it's in Kandahar or Helmand, but the fact that I want to say in the 1950s and 1960s, the U.S. sent people over to construct infrastructure at the same time that the sort of to compete with the Soviet Union for influence. So I wonder if you had a chance, given that our audience is, I imagine, interested, but some people may be less familiar with the intricacies of U.S.-Afghan relationship. Could you, I suppose, what would you like people to know about that relationship, about how the U.S. has treated Afghans in Afghanistan, throughout, we'll call it like the modern era.
Yeah, I think what folks should remember, I know that like we're like about to hit the 20-year anniversary of 9/11, and like that date is not that important. Um, Folks should also know that for like this chapter of the past 20 years for us started on September 9th of 2001, when Al Qaeda targeted Ahmad Shah Massoud, which was like a Northern Alliance commander, kind of as like this like precursor to the September 11th attacks. And so like I just like invite folks to step into the shoes of an Afghan and to try to figure out what our history looks like from our perspective. And, essentially you go back to the 50s and 60s, kind of headed towards like the height of the Cold War. But yeah, there's different infrastructure projects. The Soviets are competing for influence, and so is the US, and both are bad actors. Like Afghans just happen to be strategically located in Central Asia, and which makes them also just like if we become pawns in this like global chess game. Unfortunately, that's the real, I think, context. It just deprioritizes the value of Afghan life, because when the US, for example, starts sending USAID money and supports like, it's funny because we've been nation building, quote unquote, for the past 20 years, but it really started in the 50s and 60s. And the Soviets did their part. The Soviets built the Salon Tunnel up in the north, which is obviously, if you're familiar with Afghanistan, it's this famous tunnel that takes you from one side to another side of the Hindu Kush Mountains. And I think like the battle kind of heats up somewhere around the 70s. I have a friend of mine who actually he's a more recent Afghan refugee, and he's absolutely a wonderful person. And his name is Omar. And I'm sure he has no idea that I'm going to talk about him on this podcast. But like he was a young boy in Afghanistan. He came over to the U.S. I think within the last like 8 years or so. And I'm born in the West, so we are wildly different generations of like Afghan immigrants and different backgrounds. But he was sent to a madrasa, because that's just one of those things that happens depending on where in Afghanistan you live. But he was reading a book that was sent by the Americans, that kind of like encourages certain parts of it talks about jihad and Islamic fanaticism. And so like the US plays a really key role in kind of like stoking the fires and stoking and basically encouraging one side of the proxy war. And in the 70s, essentially it becomes there's two major like communist and Marxist parties, and they kind of battle over influence. But communism is like the dominant form of ideology in Afghan politics, which is obviously detrimental to the U.S. And so the U.S. kind of sides with the Islamists in the country and encourages, spreads literature, and it slowly works its way up. And again, both the U.S. and the Soviet Union are bad actors here. And this is all just also the prelude to all of this is that the U.S. uses aid money in this and weaponizes it in this detrimental way, I think, because it also tries to put forth projects that are beneficial to themselves, but not necessarily beneficial to the Afghan people. But I think the important part of the history starts is when the Cold War specifically heats up. I think the Soviet Union makes a gross miscalculation by invading Afghanistan, but everybody kind of just like keeps on escalating. The U.S. is escalating by like sending all this literature that encourages jihad. The USSR has like this heavy hand in Afghan politics. they kind of try to dictate to Afghans what to do. Essentially, they get fed up and send in the army, and it's a ground invasion. But at the same time, the U.S. sees that as an opportunity as well. And if you watch the Charlie Wilson's War, it's just this like misportrayal of what happens.
Yeah,
and the U.S. doesn't see the Afghan people as saving. Well, if you speak to many Afghans today, I think there's a lot of Afghans. This is, by the way, not my generation. There's a lot of Afghans who love Reagan. They see Reagan as this because he supported the Mujahideen in the 80s. But the U.S. escalates too, right? Like the Soviets invade, but the U.S. escalates too. It becomes party to this conflict. It sends Stinger missiles. It uses Pakistan and the ISI to send arms and funnel weapons and arms into the country, and to it's bad news for the Soviet Union, but it's just also bad news for the Afghan people, because it eventually that delves into a civil war, which creates the Taliban, and that takes us kind of to modern day 9/11, and then the 20-year occupation. It's a lot of history to cover, but I would say we're looking at a good 50 plus years of failed foreign policy, and just not failed foreign policy because the U.S. doesn't meet any of its goals either. It fails the American people, it fails the American government, and most importantly, it fails the Afghan people.
I recall having a conversation with one of the Afghan, really just one of the day laborers. We on our government compound, we had a lot of work that needed to get done. And so we would bring in, we had access to funds that would just let us do cash withdrawals, and we could pay people to work. So, we'd bring in people to help us. And it probably would come as no surprise that we had this compound that when we got the building, it was kind of crumbling and falling apart. And, everything needed to be redone, needed to be cleaned, needed to be emptied, et cetera. Septic tank hadn't been emptied in years. Well, the building was built in 2004, and I was there in 2009. So that gives some indication of the durability of some of the things that had been built. It had been built with a USAID grant. But as we were refitting this place, we would bring people in to help us work, contractors to help, and then just local people who were looking for jobs, we'd bring people in so they could, we just work together, anything from digging a trench to run cabling to a generator to, painting, cleaning, et cetera. And one guy was talking to me, and he was just like, he asked me, and had an interpreter with me, he was like, does it ever weird you out that your government is paying both sides of this war? And I was a little taken aback by this, but we talked about it. He's like, well, everyone knows that the U.S. gives money to Pakistan, and the Pakistanis fund the Taliban. And so you're basically you're here getting paid to fight a war where they're also paying your enemies. And I was really taken aback by this, but I was like, I don't really have an answer, because you're right. I know you're correct. I mean, it may be reduced to simpler terms, but that fundamentally is what's happening here. But then also, if you go back to this, I used to joke with my friends that when we were there, that if we get hit by an RPG or get shot by small arms, chances are really good that the bullets or the munitions, the rounds, whatever, were paid for by our parents' taxes in the 80s. Mm-hmm. All of this stuff is, we've basically, and people didn't want to face this, the people didn't want to admit this to themselves, but my experience was that in the eyes of people in villages, we were no different than the Soviets. We just replaced the Soviets in terms of our demeanor, in terms of what they experienced on a daily basis, as far as how their lives went, how we affected it. I had instances, and my friends had instances too, where we would visit villages that were really isolated, and people thought we were Soviets. They thought we were Russians. And I had a friend who went to Ashura one time, and the guy, one of the elders, basically told him, look, we just don't want communism. We've been telling you this for years. So that people can kind of chuckle at that, but also that's kind of a grim manifestation of the fact that we treat this like it's a thing that only started in 2001. But for Afghan people, the U.S. has been there for a long time, and the result of that has been mostly detrimental. And I guess given that situation, I wanted to ask you, we got about 10 minutes left. So you have a lot of lines of effort here, whether it's fundraising, whether it's volunteering to help do research, whether it's lobbying elected representatives, whether it's assisting with filing paperwork for people if you know the system or you are a lawyer who handles immigration, et cetera. So I wanted to just kind of give you the floor. People listening to this may have a connection to Afghanistan, or may just be interested in the topic may be operating out of concern for the situation for Afghan people. How can people help you?
I think there's a variety of different things that folks can do. And I think the very first thing is that I've, in the past 10 days, met veterans, not just online, but through a variety of different groups and mechanisms and volunteer efforts. Because this has been my most positive interactions with veterans in a really long time, and I'm mentioning that specifically because I think, like, I'm about to like move towards the call to action, but I just want to like relate the pain and sometimes misery that the Afghan people feel. I think there's like that's something that a lot of soldiers can relate to as well, as like folks who have seen conflict, who have to who have done multiple tours and then have to come reacclimate to regular society. And I think the same applies for these Afghan refugees right now. You know, like they land here and there's a bit of happiness, but it's shell shock, it's culture change, it's pain, the pain of like leaving your country. And you know, our the campaign we're running is called Afghans for a Better Tomorrow, which you can find on Twitter at Afghans Tomorrow. We're on Instagram at Afghans for a Better Tomorrow. We even have a website for folks who still use their browser to go to certain website. We are at weareafghans.org. There's a variety of like actions you can take through there. One of them is signing our petition. We're at like, I think, close to 110,000. We're going to try and attempt to do some kind of like petition delivery to President Biden. And then we have like a congressional call script that we are asking folks to use to pressure lawmakers into keeping. Right now, our asks have changed, obviously, because the situation on the ground has changed. You know, we are asking the Biden administration to keep the airport secure, running operational, and to obviously like have some orderly fashion of allowing folks to get in. You know, during in this very moment while we're recording our this podcast, like folks are unable to get in. Like I have spent the last 12 days with the least amount of sleep in my life to try to like find some way for folks to be evacuated, and I've not succeeded. And what we are asking people to do is to sign the petition, to call their Congress member, and to do that multiple times a day. But I think my specific ask is that right now, it's like what I mentioned earlier. We're trying to enter like the deeper consciousness of America, and what I need for folks to do, I think the word that is what I'm trying to use here is activate. You know, so for folks who are listening in to this podcast and looking for actionable items, yes, sign the petition. Yes, call your Congress person, and then have conversations with other people and activate your network. Because I'm not connected to your network. You know, like I'm connected to my own community and some other community organizers, and that's about it. Maybe some Twitter followers here and there, but this is what we're hoping to do. We're hoping people are like tapping and activating into their networks and like raising a consciousness. And like for veterans, I think this is also personal. You know, like they are leaving friends behind. They are leaving what they consider often like. I don't mean to like speak for veterans on this, but it seems like, you know, they consider them fellow soldiers. You know, they served with them. They served alongside. They had their lives saved by these guys sometimes. And I would say, you know, there is a real opportunity to be able to get these folks to the US or elsewhere. And so I'm hoping people can kind of follow those steps. If people want to make money donations, also like through our social media channels, especially our Twitter, like I think it just has a bunch of different places to donate to. I mentioned the Humanitarian Parole fundraising effort, which is unfortunately has to be a large effort. So like your money really matters there, and the more the better. I would also suggest donating to like humanitarian efforts. So Doctors Without Borders /MSF, I think, is a good one in this very moment. There is a organization called WISE, WISE, in capital letters. And if you just Google that, WISE Afghanistan, that will pop up. And then Read to Lead is another one that is currently helping internally displaced folks in Afghanistan. Many of who have come to Kabul because the rest of the country is just so awful. And those are kind of the organizations I can vouch for. The organizations are actually run by friends of mine and community members. So those are the different ways I think folks can be useful.
I would also say for listeners, if you are a former military officer, you can recommend people for P1 and P2 visas. I didn't realize this until a couple of days ago, but when they say government official, as a former military officer, I don't know about non-commissioned officers or enlisted. So obviously, the military class system strikes again. But if you were a former officer, your DD-214, the P1/P2 form that they have from state, and your letter of recommendation is enough to get someone entered into the system. Obviously, things are like getting a response from anyone is a challenge, but in terms of the requisites of the program, that's enough to make a recommendation. And so if you people who follow me on Twitter know my DMs are open. If you want more information, please contact me. I will link to Afghans for a Better Tomorrow. I will link to your New York Times piece, Arash. And I just want to say thank you. I know it's late at night in California. Thank you so much for making time for this today. I really do hope that people have gotten something out of hearing it, and that folks who want to help now have more resources for where to go. So thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and I appreciate being given a platform to talk about what's going on in Afghanistan. I really appreciate it.